Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to look at some of the key principles that have been covered in fantastic presentations so far. The more I learn about human behaviour change, the more I see it everywhere, and I think these last few days have kind of given me even more insight into kind of the work that's going on in varying different parts of the world, in varying different spheres. I think it's that fascination with learning about animal behaviour, whether it be human behaviour, other species, that fascinates me, and it's clear that it fascinates everybody here. My increasing involvement in digging deeper into human behaviour change from the perspective of evidence-based theory and applying that to practice, I think that links in very well with what's been covered so far this morning in terms of making sure that we have in place that scientific evidence to move things forwards. But it's very clear from even when you look at yourself from a point of view of human behaviour change, that it is a challenge. If you think from our own perspectives, that thing of you want to change your behaviour, maybe you want to do more exercise, eat less chocolate, drink less wine, but how difficult is actually to change those individual behaviours? So I'm just going to talk about some of the sort of key principles that have been covered so far, but also I'm going to touch on another model that I've looked at from a point of view I think is particularly useful. So I'm going to try and multitask. So it's just covering some of the human behaviour change approaches, but also touching on the COM-B model, which the Brook team have given a fantastic kind of introduction to in terms of some of their work that they've been covering. So looking at the COM-B model, which is linked to the behaviour change wheel. So before I get started, something to think about in terms of what we've been covering during this conference. Well, this is where my slides are now going to play up and not work again. Oh. No, I might have to tell you this. It's obviously something grumbling with my slides. So the statements I was going to cover, the only way to improve animal welfare is to change human behaviour. Animal abuse and neglect are a product of human behaviour. As humans, we know how to change the behaviour of other humans. And the final thing just to think about, human behaviour change is all about changing negative behaviour to a positive one. It's something I'm going to return to at the end of the presentation. And I've got another blank slide, so I've got to remind myself, actually that's not going to work because it had some lovely pictures. No, that's unfortunate, because I don't know if I can really describe these. One of the pictures was of spatial awareness. So it was some work that's been done in Germany, Belgium and the UK, and probably other areas as well, where they've taken a town in terms of the town planning. They've removed the road signs and the painted markings on the roads to take a different approach, because they were seeing a lot of issues to do with accidents. So they've done that to try and remove and take a different approach to design in terms of the spatial design within a town. They have seen a reduction in the number of accidents, but I suppose the question that we have to think about is that a short-term behavioural change, or is this something that will last? From the perspective of, if they have managed to change people's behaviour from a point of view that they've slowed down, they're aware of the fact that there might be a pedestrian as they're driving through, or as the person becomes more used to the environment, will things change again? So there's a long-term aspect that we need to take into account. My next picture, which is unfortunately missing, was a picture of men's urinals, not one I entered myself, I have to note, but it had a nice little diagram, which some who've entered some of these urinals, not me, have seen, with a little fly motif. And the idea behind this was, it's fun to aim, apparently. So it was about cleaning up the urinals and making it a nice space by actually providing something that gave a bit of target practice. Another of the examples was to do with the fun theory. I don't know if anyone's heard of the fun theory, but This is something that's being worked on in terms of looking at how you can use design to actually encourage people to change their behaviour. So what they had is in a Swedish underground station, they were looking at how they could encourage people to take exercise. So they'd taken a video of people and how they were behaving in terms of using the escalators. They then set up a piano going down the stairs, which was a piano that actually made a noise as you walked up, and they filmed the behaviour of the people once the piano was in place. And it's quite fascinating. You can actually see it on YouTube. So the actual behaviour changed from going up the escalators to using the piano. The number of people, everybody was then going up the piano because of the enjoyment, the fun, the activities of doing that. So again, it's one of those things, would it become something that would become normal? So actually maybe it would become boring, but it did change behaviour in the short term. Okay, so moving on to probably another slide where we don't have any pictures. So I'm going to start doing some actions in here in terms of acting it out. This slide was looking at the application of human behaviour change from a point of view of how we might see it in design. So it's, for example, if you look at automatic watering and water devices, it's changed our behaviour in terms of actually making it easier for us, in terms of making sure that the animals have water. The animals can choose when they want to drink. They have free access. But does it also make us more complacent? Do we not know what the animal's actually drinking? Does it stop us from actually doing a check of the animal? So we kind of have to think about how things that we change in terms of our environment and how we design things may then have an impact. You think about the work that Temple Grandin's done in terms of looking at slaughter process and the work that she's done to improve the way that animals travel through to the slaughterhouse. She's looked at how she can design things so animals are less likely to be put under stress and pressure, and it's it is easier environment also for the handlers. We've talked a lot about children and the importance of education and engaging children with animals, but also that link in terms of how the children themselves can then change their parents' behaviour. I'm going to give this a whirl and see if there's any... Oh, we've got a diagram. So, back in action. I'm suspecting that the pictures that I've got with the diagram are not going to show, but we'll give it a go. Nope, they're not there. So I had some lovely pictures of how we see dogs in different ways and different perspectives. So we talked a lot about different concepts in behaviour change. So we have everything from cognition in terms of, yesterday I mentioned about how much energy the brain uses in terms of its function. And one of the things to think about with that is that the brain is using an enormous amount of energy. So as a human being, we're very inclined to take mental shortcuts. We want to make things easy, and that's also a factor we need to take into account when we're looking at behaviour change, is how can we make things easier for people? Because by nature, they will try and save energy mentally. If you look at, a lot of people have talked about motivation, looking at how we can actually impact and offer the needs, wants and desires of that person in terms of how their behaviour, why they're actually doing the behaviour in the first place, and whether we can actually engage with them to achieve change. The thing is, do we really understand humans? So if you look at some of the experiments that have been done quite some time ago, for example, some of you will be aware of Zimbardo's famous experiment at Stanford University, the Parisian experiment, which was meant to last 2 weeks and had to be cut short and only lasted a six-day period due to some of the abusive behaviour that was occurring in terms of they'd use students to some act as prison officers, some to act as prisoners. And they had to stop the experiment due to a few cases that had led to psychological torture and stress and anxiety that had occurred. So even the experimenters didn't actually foresee what was likely to happen. Other examples that have been mentioned in terms of Milgram's work, looking at the experience of deeply conflicting moral impulses and how far people will go if there's an influence in terms of an influential power, somebody who is there and seen as someone that should be followed. Mishdall's work in terms of the cake experiment, as I like to call it, which looks at delayed gratification. So it's the putting a child in the room with a cookie or a muffin and seeing how long it will be before they eat the cookie or muffin. I have to say, I think that's probably a challenge for an adult as well. But apparently, if you can delay your gratification of eating the cookie, you're going to succeed in life. So it's a bit of a test. So then moving on to lots of other things that are now missing. What we're looking at here is where we're moving forwards from a policy-making point of view. So the theories, where theory meets practice, there is a lot of work out there, and it's the fact that we've heard from so many different people from different disciplines, and it's looking at from a policy-making point of view, marketing, communications, what I like to call the ists, the psychologists, the sociologists, the anthropologists, the economists, the biologists, education, counselling, but also looking at the rural, urban, international development work that's going on with communities, people working with individuals, people working in groups, people working internationally. There's so many different elements of human behaviour change. It's a rapidly growing field, but we've still got a lot to learn. There's still a lot of things that we need to pull together in terms of the threads. One of these quotes that was stuck with me in terms of summing up kind of I think where we are with some of the things to do with human behaviour change was from Frans de Waal. I probably pronounced that badly, but one thing that bothered me as a student in the 1960s is human behaviour was totally off limits to biologists. There was animal behaviour, then there was a long time of nothing. After that came human behaviour as a totally separate category best left to a different group of scientists. I think we're in a time now where we're actually pulling things together, which is really fantastic, and it's actually trying to sort of leap off the back of that. I think it was yesterday the nudge theory was mentioned in terms of as a possible theory to look at. I would say it's suggestive. People haven't read the book. It's an interesting approach from a point of view that it argues that positive reinforcement and indirect suggestion can be used to try and achieve non-forced compliance and can influence the motives, incentives, and decision-making of groups and individuals alike. So it says at least as effectively as, or not as even more effectively, as direct instruction, legislation, and enforcement. It's about the low-hanging fruit, so something that's easy to get to. One of the things I'd also like to talk about is the work of Michie et al. They looked at 83, they basically worked up an analysis where it describes 83 theories of behaviour change. And it was identified by an expert panel of psychologists, it's back to the ists, I'm afraid, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, and economists even. And this was through looking at over 1,000 they identified 1,000 other models and theories. So a little bit of bedtime reading in terms of if we wanted to kind of move forwards with our thinking. I'm really hoping this one will be here. Yes, I have a slide with a picture on it. So, well, going back to some of the work that was talked about in terms of, you remember the Brook team talking about the capability, motivation, and opportunity. Well, I thought I'd just do a bit of a flying tour through this model because I think it's quite useful from a point of view if you're looking at having a tool to help you embed human behaviour change in the work that you're doing. I would also say it's not the quickest thing to do because it has a number of different stages and activities to follow. But what it does do is it takes you through a step-by-step approach, unpicking the behaviour, looking at the causes, the barriers and opportunities, the types of intervention that you can put into place, and how that links in terms of the actual policy landscape, so how that links into the wider context. It also drills down into specific behaviour change techniques, so how you can actually deliver that in reality. So when analysing the behaviour, it's important to think of it from the point of view of what is the problem. I mean, this may sound obvious, but it's really drilling down into that specific behaviour and unpicking it. So it's peeling off the layers. What is the cause of the problem? And what is the behaviour, or indeed what is the non-behaviour? And I think that's one of the things we need to remember, is it may be something that's not happening is the thing that we're actually trying to target. Who is doing the behaviour, and where does it occur? So in terms of the behavioural analysis, what we're looking at is what needs to change and who needs to perform the new behaviour. Because it's, as we've heard over the last few days, it's not always obvious who is the person that you're targeting. So it's actually being able to go through a process and really unpick who it is you should be focusing on. When should they be performing the behaviour? Because that's also important in terms of the timing. Where should this be undertaken, and how often? I think it's also taking into account who else is involved in that behaviour being performed, because there may well be other players that are part of this. And what could bring about the change? But as I think I've said before, and I know a lot of other speakers have said, I think it's about focusing on one or two behaviours, because in the end we want to achieve sustainable change, so it's not making it too complicated. So Mitchie has taken through a sort of process in terms of a nicely laid out step change. So looking at from the point of view of looking at the target behaviour, designing the intervention, and delivering the intervention. So I'm going to keep my fingers crossed that this is going to work. So it's not looking like it is. So, right, I'll have to do this with the marker. So in terms of when looking at capability, they talk about physical and psychological capability. So from the point of view of physical capability, that will be whether the person can actually perform the task. So do they have the skills, for example, to do the task? If we were looking at, for example, some of the projects that I'm involved in terms of issues to do with hoof care, we would say is, do the people actually have the skill to do the trimming of the hooves in the first place? In terms of psychological capability, it can be related to education. It could also be related to their own self-confidence to undertake that activity. In terms of opportunity, we've got social and physical opportunity. So when we're looking at physical opportunity, it could be, for example, are the resources available for that person to undertake it? So working in different environments, can that person actually maybe grow the food or access the food to actually feed their animals properly? In terms of the social opportunity, there's been a lot of talk about social influence. Is the environment suitable for them to do a different behaviour? Is that environment encouraging the current behaviour? And then looking at motivation, which is really important, and taking reflective motivation and automatic motivation. Is there a need for the person to think about their actions? I think one of the speakers was talking about the thing of getting people to walk their dog and go out and give their animals exercise. But they need to think about that from a reflective point of view and actually see that there's a motivation to do that, to get out there and help their animal. In terms of automatic motivation, that might be tied to emotion, for example. So, for example, one of the diagram I had was a pacer horse in America. The person may find that they are having an emotional return from that that they're getting a good sensation, but from an animal welfare point of view, it might not be the best thing for the horse. So it's taking those different things into account. Moving on to the intervention function. With Mitchie's approach, what they do is then it allows you to use this kind of analysis of the behaviour and then to look at how that is actually can be linked into the function. And I think the thing that has occurred to me when I've used this is you suddenly realise that actually you need to take into account quite a few different functions. So you might start off thinking, well, actually there's a training need. So, we've identified there's a physical need for training. But then you realise that actually, okay, through our analysis, we've also realised that there's an issue to do with the person's self-confidence, their self-efficacy, and their belief that they can actually succeed in this. So we also need to think about, enablement. We may even need to persuade them to actually engage with what we're doing. So this model, why I find it particularly useful is it actually makes you think through the process, taking one simple behaviour and actually think, okay, we started off, we've got our analysis, but actually we've got to build on this and take the right sort of threads as to what is actually going to help us move forwards. So, for example, talking about skills, we may want to include a role model within our approach. So it gives us those building blocks. Then moving on to the outer circle of the policy categories. This is where it can then link into the bigger framework. So when we're looking at things from a wider context, how is that seen in the wider context, whether it's from an organisational point of view, community perspective, government, how is that going to link into the context? So if we're taking the thread of building a capability in our physical capability, we've identified training, so we're going to understand that we need to have some service provision. But linked to that, we also may need to take into account other things. So, for example, do we have communications, a need for communications and marketing from a point of view getting the message across? It's one of those sort of fail-safe ways of kind of thinking, right, I've got a checklist, have I missed anything? Okay. And then looking at the sort of final whistle-stop tour in terms of the behavioural change techniques, there are 93 of these, so it takes a little bit of going through and reading. And if you just look at goal and planning alone, for example, if you take goal setting, they've broken it down from a point of view of looking at behaviour. You've also got goal setting in terms of outcomes. So it's whether you're looking at it from a point of view of is the behaviour itself something that you're focusing on, or is the outcome? Is the animal actually having access to water, the thing that you're actually looking at as your target, or is it the behaviour that the person has actually filled the water tank up? Is that your target? So it's kind of being able to actually identify what tools you're using. The other things to take into account are actually how those are being delivered. So it's the delivery of the behaviour change techniques, who you're aiming at, and the timings of doing so. So just to come back to my opening remarks about some of the things to think about, and unfortunately I'll have to do this off here because I don't have them there. So I was posed the statements: the only way to improve animal welfare is to change human behaviour. And animal abuse and neglect are a product of human behaviour. I think human behaviour change is pivotal to successfully improving animal welfare. And I do personally think that animal abuse and neglect are largely a product of human behaviour. Other people may think differently, and I'd love to talk to you about those sorts of examples during the break. But I personally believe that it is central, human behaviour change is central to actually achieving some lasting change. So in terms of another nice little picture without any text, as humans we know how to change the behaviour of other humans. I think in terms of that statement, one of the things I would say is it's complicated, it's multifaceted, and I think the presentations that have gone so far have really clearly demonstrated it. We need to take an evidence and theory-based approach and examine the lessons learned and share those lessons so we can kind of take that forwards. And then finally, in terms of human behaviour change, in terms of changing, is it all about changing negative behaviour to a positive one? I think we've also can all understand that it may not be the case. We may have a consequence that we hadn't foreseen. We may end up with a situation where the behaviour that we wanted to achieve is not the one that's the outcome. So we always have to bear in mind when we're designing our intervention, is there an unforeseen consequence of what we're doing? And could it actually lead to a negative behaviour? And I think one of the points that's been raised about ethics is a really important thing that needs to be thought about from a point of view of taking these talks forwards. So in terms of moving forwards, this is a great start. This conference has been fantastic, and being able to talk to so many of you about human behaviour change has been, I think one of the speakers mentioned about something that they've been waiting for a long time. I share that sentiment. We talked yesterday about the think tank and that providing an opportunity, and thank you very much for those who've engaged in that activity, and please do get involved. It does offer us an opportunity to take things forwards with human behaviour change, and I think this is a great start. And one of the things I'd like to do, because I've got the microphone still, is I'd like to thank this lady here, because I think it's absolutely fantastic.